Good evening. Well, like Pastor Jonathan said, I am a refugee of the public school system. I'm currently teaching at Unity Classical Charter School, which is right down the road from here. But I did spend the past 5 years as a middle school educator, a middle school teacher, specifically in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. And the first 3 years of that was fine. But starting 2 years ago, starting in 2020, the culture war started coming to my school. The culture war started coming to my classroom. The crazy things that I always thought would just be in San Francisco, I would just see it on YouTube, I would just see it on Fox News. Those things were being sent to me as PowerPoints to show to my own classes. And I do want to say that what man intended for evil, God was able to use for good. Number one, by putting me on a better path as an educator, and number two, by giving Pastor Jonathan and me the impetus for tonight's event. And I want to start out with a little informal survey. One is obviously a perfectly good apple, going all the way to a 5, which is completely I don't know if you could even call that an apple, but I'm going to throw out some places, and I want you to hold up either a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5. So I've already picked on San Francisco a bit. How would you rate the public education system in a place like San Francisco? So either a 1, a 2, 3, a 4, a 5. Okay, yeah, about what I expected, a 5. What about just North Carolina in general? Just the state of public schools in North Carolina. I know that's a big general question. Okay. Now it's a bit more mixed. What about South Carolina? Okay. What about the public schools in your area? The public schools that your children are currently going to, or they will go to in the future, or they would go to if you chose to educate them in the public schools. How would you rate those schools? Okay. Well, I don't think I'm presuming too much when I say that we're all here tonight because we recognize deep problems with public education. Some of you saw those problems and you already pulled your children out of public schools. Some of you have children in public school, but you're worried about how long you can keep them there. Some of you, like me, this is my personal situation, you may have children who aren't quite old enough for public school, but you're wondering if in good conscience, can you send those kids to those schools that you drive by every day? But I want to say, regardless of our individual circumstances, we probably all wish that we had a public school system that we could trust, a public school system that we could rely upon without worry. That's what I wanted just professionally. I wanted a good, nice public school system that I could do 20 or 30 years, get a good pension, have a nice salary, and be done with it. But, that's not the case. And obviously, we're all here because we know that's not the case. But I don't want us to see that as a negative. I don't want us to see that as an additional burden, because I think a shaky and questionable public school system is the spurring we all need to give our children the education they deserve, and I want to say that is a Christian education. So for my talk, I'm going to answer 3 questions. Number 1, why do we need Christian education? Number 2, what is Christian education? And number 3, how do we do Christian education? So why do we need it? What is it? And how do we do it? So, number 1, the main reason we need Christian education is because God is sovereign over all things. The Lordship of Christ, it's not confined to church on a Sunday morning. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, it says, "For by him," which is Christ, it says, "all things were created." All things were created through him and for him. So, how can you take, and that's what I want to emphasize, how can you take the creator and sustainer of all things and leave him out of biology class? How can you leave him out of any class? How can you think that, his lordship is just in your own personal life or just on a Sunday morning? Obviously, it's not. So that's what I wanted to draw attention to. All right. And it's also not a question of if, but which. Education cannot be religiously neutral. You're catechizing, you're indoctrinating, you are bringing up your child into a worldview. It's either a Christian worldview or a non-Christian worldview. It's either explicitly Christian or implicitly or explicitly not Christian. And when thinking about what worldview is going to win out, you also need to think about the hours they spend in school versus the hours they spend in church, and ask yourself, okay, what's going to have more of an effect on them? What's going to actually mold their thoughts, mold their heart, just based on the sheer number of hours that they spend in a place? You take the average kid, and from kindergarten all the way up to when he graduates from high school, that's about 16,000 hours. Take that same kid, K through 12, he's going to church every Sunday. He might, he gets sick, he lays out for a week or two, he goes on Wednesday, he goes to some church camps. But when it's all done, by the time he graduates from high school, how many hours is that? 845. So even if it's not something, even if the schools aren't teaching them something necessarily bad or something that's going to make you jump out of your seat, it's not giving them what they need to grow up to be Christian young people. And we can look around and we can see the fruits of neutral education. Neutral education does make children rudderless ships, just kind of floating along the waters of the world, being blown whichever way the winds of the world take them, being forced along whatever the way the currents of the world take them. They don't have an anchor. They don't have any sails. They don't have a navigation pushing them or guiding them a certain way. They're just floating whichever way the world takes them. And, thinking about that, is it any wonder that anxiety, depression, suicide is on the rise among young people? We think about a lot of young people even questioning one of the most fundamental elements of human life, which is their biological sex, which is their gender identity. Also, a neutral education, or so-called neutral education, it deprives children of their spiritual immune system. The spiritual immune system they need to resist the contagions of the world. According to a 2007 report by Lifeway Research, about 7 out of 10 Christian kids in public school abandon Christ in college. So think back to those numbers I showed you on the previous slide. 16,000 plus hours spent in school versus only about 850 hours spent in church. And, neutral education just doesn't work that well. When you look around, what do you see? You see an educational system that's collapsing. You see a public educational system that just seems to smash into one crisis after another. Test scores dropping. Children know less and less, it seems, each year. Their behavior's out of control. Each generation seems more ignorant, seems more vulgar than the previous one. So even by its own standards, the standards that they measure success by, it doesn't perform that well. And I'm probably pushing an open door by criticizing the public school system and saying that we need Christian education. But once we establish that we need Christian education, we need to answer the question, what is Christian education? And I want to give a very basic definition of Christian education, a big umbrella definition that could fit to many different types of schooling. And with tonight's Roundtable Q&A section, we'll explore the different options available with Christian education. But a very key verse to define what Christian education is Ephesians 6:4. And it goes as such. And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And I want to focus on the last half of that verse. Bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Okay? So that phrase, nurture and admonition, it refers to the whole child. It refers not just to his intellect, but also to his body, also to his eternal soul. And also of the Lord means that the nurturing and admonishing being done is uniquely Christian. We know that non-believing parents, they can raise their kids to be college and career successful. They can raise their kids to be law-abiding good citizens. But, that's not the main focus of Christian education. You want to raise them in the Lord. And a good way to define Christian education, to apply that verse, is directing the moral, rational, and spiritual development of your children towards Christ-honoring maturity. So you're directing his moral sense, his rational sense, and his spiritual self towards Christ-honoring maturity. And that's not to say that we want everyone ignorant. We want everyone just to read the Bible and that's it. But once a child knows who they are in Christ, or all of us, once we know who we are in Christ, once we are firmly established in our identity in Christ, a lot of those questions about what should I study, what school should I go to, what's a career that's best for me and best for my family, best for my future, a lot of those things, they fall into place already. And another question, how do we do Christian education? And education should always begin and end with the parents. It begins and ends with the parents. Notice in that verse I quoted, it said fathers, it says parents, bring up your children. It doesn't say, public school system, public school teachers, bring up your children. Politicians, bring up your children. No, it's the main duty and responsibility of the parents. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, he was a UK minister, a minister from the UK. He has a great quote. He says, "We, the parents, are the guardians and custodians of this soul," meaning the child's soul. So once again, before we even talk about homeschooling, charter schooling, virtual school, any of that, we have to realize that we're bringing them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and it begins and ends with the parents. Those are two fundamental things that each of us have to lock in place and really understand before we can go further in trying to figure out what type of schooling is best. But responsibility doesn't mean total self-sufficiency. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to be the Lone Ranger. Every family has to delegate certain parts of their child's education to certain people at certain times. Even the most hardcore, extreme homeschooler, they're using books written by someone else. They're using materials created by someone else. So it's easy to feel overwhelmed that, okay, this was something that I thought I could just trust to the government, to the public school system. It is overwhelming to think that, okay, now all that's on me. But it doesn't have to be overwhelming. You just have to realize that even though I'm responsible, it doesn't mean we have to be totally self-sufficient. And I know we're going to talk about this more during the panel, different schooling options, but I wanted to bring to mind options that kind of blur the lines between these three categories. When we think about schooling options, we think about three main options. We think about public school. We think about private school. We think about homeschooling. But a lot of different options nowadays that kind of overlap and blur the lines between those three areas. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the concept of a homeschooling co-op. Okay, well, I don't really have to explain it. But yeah, a homeschooling co-op, individual families, they do the bulk of the learning at home, but they meet as a group at certain times, at a certain schedule, to learn together and to do different social events. So it kind of takes out that isolation that's typically associated with being a homeschooling family. Charter school. I'm currently working at a charter school. A charter school receives government money, but it operates independently of the public school system. So it operates with a degree of autonomy that's not common at a public school. But whenever you receive money from anybody, there are strings attached. You know, you got to go into the school knowing that. But it still has more autonomy than a regular public school. Virtual school, it's a school that operates completely online. And then university model. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the university model. Okay. I think some people do that model. But basically, with the university model, students attend school maybe 2 to 3 days a week, so maybe 18 to 20 hours a week, and then they do the rest of the learning at home. So even though they may be a middle school or high school student, they're only going to school maybe 18, 20 hours a week, like a college student. But then the family and the child is responsible for doing the rest of it at home. So, yeah, those are the main schooling options that blur the lines. And before as I close, I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. Like I said before, you are in control. A child's education does begin and end with the parents. And it's easy to be bullied into thinking otherwise. It's easy to be bullied by experts, either so-called experts or maybe they are experts in a certain content area. It's easy to be bullied into thinking that you're not qualified. But, you know, my mechanic knows more about my car than I do. But that doesn't make the mechanic the owner of my car. You know, that doesn't give the mechanic the right to, you know, forcibly take my keys and drive my car into the shop and to do things that I don't want to do with my car. You know, a plumber, a carpenter, an electrician, those tradesmen probably know more about the operation of my house or your house than I do or most of us do. But, you know, that doesn't give the carpenter the right to start knocking out walls and putting in additions to your house just because he thinks it's best. And it's the same with parents. It's the same with children. There are people that know more about physics. There are people that know more about a particular content area than you do, but that doesn't give them control of your children. And also, you know, you are not alone. You know, God is on your side. In Romans 8:31, it says, if God is for us, who can be against us? And of course, God is going to be for you if you're educating your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And then also, you know, strength is in numbers. In Ecclesiastes 4:12, it says, though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. You know, if you take any family, any child, and you separate them, you isolate them, what do you have? You have one string. You have one strand. How easy is that to break apart? How easy is that for the forces of the world to just pull it apart or cut it in twain? But if instead of isolating individuals, instead of isolating children, instead of isolating Christian families, the more we can join together, the more we can braid ourselves together, it's a lot harder for the world to pull apart. It's a lot harder for the world to cut in two. And then also, I think Pastor Jonathan already said this. I hope this is not the last word. I hope this isn't the final word that Lake Wylie has to say about Christian education. And I hope it's the start of a long conversation. And